recording. Oh, wait, if you just mute the sound on your computer. Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Callie Lambar. I'm the Administrative Assistant in the Office of Sustainability. And I'm here to welcome you to this fourth presentation of the Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. I want to thank everybody who came out in person and online, and also our co-sponsors, the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee, as well as Office of Research and Development Programs. So now everyone join me in welcoming our presenters today, and they're a very interesting topic. Why do mushroom farms in Pennsylvania smell so bad? Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. So good afternoon. It's afternoon now. Everybody, thank you for coming. My name is Daniel Engelbrecht. I'll be presenting with Jess Hampton and Dr. Nwinee, and we're mentored by Dr. Lorenzo and Cena. We're all from the College of Health Sciences and the Environmental Health Science program and the Masters of Public Health. So to start things off with a little bit of context, why do mushroom farms smell so bad? We have to consider where we're talking about with our perspective on this issue. We're talking about Chester County, Pennsylvania. One of the important things about Westchester University is that it really emphasizes community services to our neighbors and surrounding areas. And so the context for this is Chester County, Pennsylvania. And if anybody's ever been to Kennett Square, you know a little bit about mushrooms already. The mushroom capital of the world. It's not a coincidence it's called that. In fact, the majority of mushrooms are produced there. They're distributed across different countries and especially through the United States here. If you were to get in your car right now, depending on traffic, of course, it'd take you about 20 minutes to get there if you drove to the southwest. That's Kennett Square. And just a little bit about what they're producing down here. These are just a couple random examples of things that they grow in this region. This is called a maitake mushroom. It's known as the hen of the woods, and looking at the picture, I think you can tell why. It very much looks like a hen. So shiitake mushrooms, these are in the wild. There's not really an analogy as to why they're called that, but that's their name. And then just to go a little bit further with another example, pom-pom mushrooms. They look like cheerleader pom-poms, but the analogy for this one is it's a lion's mane. And I think they really had a perspective about naming things after animals, because that looks more like shredded coconut to me than it does a lion's mane, but I digress. So what are mushrooms good for? What's the point? Why bother? So something interesting to think about if you were to go into the wild, knowing what we know already through research, there's approximately 2,000 species of edible mushrooms that are known to man. That's in a body of 14,000. So if you do the math, it winds up being, if you were in the wild and you ate a random mushroom, that's about a 14% chance that it was safe to eat. So don't go eating random mushrooms. They're particularly used in cuisine. They are vegan, but they don't fit into Jainism, which is an Indian religion, which is really focused on not destroying a planet. So to eat a mushroom, you have to pluck it from the soil and consume it, which would basically kill it. There's health benefits that are associated with it, which include cancer risk reduction. They're low in sodium. They don't do well at taking up salt, so they're really good for salads or any other forms of cuisine you're using them for. Shiitake mushrooms in general are more linked to lowering cholesterol versus all the mushrooms. So shiitake mushroom is known for this particular property. Brain health preservation, which is pretty interesting. I'll talk more about that in just a second. So they also support the gut microbiome. So if anybody's had something called kombucha, fermented mushroom teas and various things that mushrooms go into can help with your gut biome. They are rich in vitamins and minerals, so they fit in with a very healthy diet. Not related to this topic, but something of ongoing research is the mental health benefits that come from mushrooms. Psilocybin-based mushrooms are known to cause depression reduction and help with PTSD. So just giving credit to that, it's an emerging research field. So something to look forward to as time goes forward. So what is the mushroom industry and its relevance to Chester County? So in a short span of 100 years, well, 130 now or so, the late 1800s, William Swain, he's credited as the father of the mushroom growing in the United States. His story is based in local legend that he was a gardener who saw so much empty space in his planter boxes that he wanted to use something else to facilitate closing in the gaps. So he traveled to Europe and bought some spores and came back and started growing them with his own garden. And then he eventually was credited with making the first mushroom house in Chester County, Pennsylvania. The American Mushroom Institute was formed in 1955. It's a trade organization, a trade association. It represents businesses and marketers in the mushroom industry, and they're really credited with helping this industry grow and exist. Later, the grandson of William Swain, which is John B. Swain, he formed Swain Spawn Company in 1981, which eventually sold in 1999. They were really focused on producing spores into this area so that way people could actually continue to grow here. And we'll talk a little bit further on that in a moment. But as of 2017, there were over 1,200 mushroom farms that existed in the US. So we went from in the short span of about 130 years, William Swain creating the first grow house to over 1,200. So it's really grown. Just to give you an example, two examples of what grow houses look like. They're kept dark, so you really wouldn't be able to see in them. The guy on the right, of course, he needs light to be able to harvest the mushrooms, and the gentleman on the left looks like he's cleaning the floors. So these are kept dark. There's a lot of soil, there's a lot of substrate in here, there's mushroom spores, and this is really how they do it. This is kind of a cookie cutter approach to what growing mushrooms looks like anywhere on the planet. So to take a little closer look, these mushrooms have to grow on something, and we call that the growth substrate. It's made out of compost. It starts with a mix of ingredients that just get digested over time. It includes straw, chicken, and horse manure. And then you probably start to wonder why mushroom farms stink. Here's the hint. Gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, and ground corn cobs. They all get included into a composting cycle, which helps provide the nutrients that are needed to grow these mushrooms. So a little bit more of the growing cycle. They create windrows, which you can see on the left photo here. They're really hot. They release a lot of steam. There's bacteria that are digesting these organic ingredients to create nutrients for the mushrooms to be grown on. The next step is when they're done with the composting cycle is that they'll actually inoculate the spores into the growth substrate, which will then be grown in those houses, which I showed you earlier. And by the end of it, you will see the spent mushroom compost, which you can see the marked difference in the color. It's really just soil that has lost its nutrients. There's a lot of uses for this. It's one of the focuses of why we're talking about why mushroom farms are so stinky, if you will. Just to give you a little bit of context as to how we came about this project. This wasn't something that we were aware of until New Garden Township, which is highlighted on the map here, reached out to Westchester University. In the context that there has been a growth in the mushroom industry, we know, looking backwards, that we found half of fresh mushrooms grown in the US come from southeastern Pennsylvania alone, which had a market share during the growing season of 2022, which is 2023, of over $1 billion, just slightly over $1 billion. So we see the historical perspective and the good of the business, which has really helped this area grow economically, though it was completely coincidental that it grew, that these two, the substrate producers as well as the mushroom growing happened here. Really, the idea, if we produced the substrate here and then grew mushrooms in Idaho, we would have to transport the substrate here. So these two kind of coexisted together to create these, the type of business in this particular area. So with the sustainability perspective, as to whether this is sustainable or not, what I haven't talked about is the residential concerns that come with this. What really gets missed behind this is that the businesses are able to produce $1 billion market share, but there are some concerns that come with this type of industry. So there's noxious odor complaints, right? The residents, if you've ever been through Kennett Square, some of you may have smelled some of these smells already. They'll give you a headache. They smell pretty bad. It's persistent there. So the residents through all of this time have more or less been complaining about that. They've seen metal corrosion in their houses and their durable equipments like air conditioners, and different sources of metal on the property. And with that, of course, how does that tie into a person's health? What does breathing all this in really mean? So the township manager of New Garden Township, Christopher Himes, reached out to Westchester University and got in contact with Dr. Cena, and we wound up with our scope, which is to conduct ambient air sampling in New Garden Township. Why do they smell so bad? We had to figure this out. So some of the health concerns that are associated with this that we know of already is that when there's a decay of organic matter, which you've seen in the windrows, is that these piles can release hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia. And methane, you might know already, is a greenhouse gas. So we do know the most concerning one is hydrogen sulfide. We know if a person's exposed, we know from a long body of research about this topic, almost 100 years old, which is almost as old as the mushroom growing industry in Pennsylvania, that in low concentrations of exposure, which we have a range there for, you can really smell strong odors. So if you're going through Kennett Square and you're smelling strong odors, chances are it could be hydrogen sulfide. What will happen when you inhale this? You'll have irritation of your eyes, your respiratory system. Those are common complaints with somebody who has a low concentration exposure. As it gets higher, you start to experience dizziness, nausea, headache, really, really unpleasant, especially if you live in the area. Higher concentrations really run into problems. And so this is one of the reasons why we've been asked to look at the health perspective of this. Though we're really, our scope is to focus on the air sampling, not so much what does this mean for a resident's health. Just want to delineate that this isn't a health study, this is an air quality study. So up to that high concentration, somebody could experience severe respiratory irritation, difficulty breathing, convulsions, death is possible when it gets really high. And you lose the ability to detect the gas because your olfactory nerves become fatigued. So I'm going to hand it over to Victor, who's going to talk about a little bit further with the literature review.
Thank you, Daniel. So in the past, studies have been done related to what we were doing. And it was showed that Cobb et al. In 1995 reported some health effects amongst residents who live near mushroom farm operations. But the survey was done among 75 people, and it was just done on one day. So you cannot really determine that 1 day sampling of information that was gathered was due to the long-term effect of mushroom farm. So, and of course, there were no elevated gases like that detected in that study. Another study done in 2022, Smith et al. Showed that they only focused their equipment within the facility. So they had equipment to measure carbon dioxide, moisture, airflow, and temperature, but they did not focus on some of these gases, even though they did some air quality study in the mushroom industry. And they did not investigate, like I said, those gases of concern. In 2022, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection did a study, and they recorded a high level of 0.2 parts per million of gas emitted from the mushroom industry. And so on the background of this, we decided to ask some research questions. Are there really elevated concentrations of gases like hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane in the ambient air around where mushroom farm operations take place? And do these concentrations vary with season, with the weather, with temperature, and over time? And we decided to, use equipment to quantify exposure to methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia gas released or emitted around mushroom farm operations over a period of 12 months. Other studies that have been done in 2013 showed that, so like Daniel said, there's a spent mushroom compost after the mushroom farm cycle for about 6 months. Some of the substrates are recycled, for further use, and they can be used to because they still contain some nutrients. But previous studies showed that some of this spent mushroom compost contain large amounts of hydrogen sulfide, and when they are kept in piles like that and distributed, a large amount of these gases are released, when they are being recycled for other purposes. The larger the heap size, the more the hydrogen sulfide. It was also shown that the moisture content also determined how much of hydrogen sulfide will be released. Outdoor piles that were kept, had poor control of moisture compared to indoor moisture content, so that there will be more hydrogen sulfide released from those in indoor facilities. Okay, I've talked about this before. For protection of the environment, the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety put out a recommendation that no more than 10 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide should be allowed for a period of 10 minutes or maximum, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration permits no more than 20 parts per million. That's for workers, but for the general public, the Department of Environmental Protection recommended that no more than 0.1 parts per million for a period of 1 hour, or no more than 0.005 parts per million for a 24-hour period is recommended for the general population. This difference shows that for workers, they are more tolerable. There's a phenomenon called the healthy workers phenomenon, so that the lower concentration that is permissible for the environment or for the population is to protect vulnerable groups like children, people with asthma, people with bronchitis, emphysema, so that there are even very little concentrations will not be permitted for the general public versus with workers who work there over time.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about a bad neighbor versus a good neighbor. So a bad neighbor is an individual or a company who is displaying inconsiderate behavior towards other neighbors, and this often leads to disturbances, annoyances, and in extreme cases, sometimes property damage. So in terms of this study, the strong persistent odors of hydrogen sulfide gas, they're a direct relationship. The gases that result from the spent mushroom compost, they're going to diffuse into the ambient environment through wind patterns and thermal gradients, which allow them to disperse over long distances. And because of this, people are going to bear the brunt of the pollution, even though they're not contributing to it at all. Oh, another thing. And then pollution, it doesn't know any boundaries. That's an important theme we've learned in public health. So a good neighbor is an individual or a company who is considering their potential impacts on other neighboring communities, and then they're actively collaborating to address health concerns that may or may not arise. So in terms of air pollution, this refers to proactive measures that are being taken to reduce air pollution emissions, thereby preventing significant contributions to air quality problems in other neighborhood areas. An example of this would be industries installing advanced pollution control technologies to monitor and reduce the emissions of harmful gases like hydrogen sulfide. So moving on to our materials and methodology for this study. So the first thing we had to do was our literature review on the topic. So we anticipated the needs we would need for the study to quantify gas emissions, which led us to the area monitors we used. All these devices, they were located 100 to 600 feet away from point sources. I have a Google Maps image and a few slides I'll show you guys, but they were actively sampling for the 3 gases of ammonia, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. The recordings, the data was being recorded in 10-second intervals for a 1-year study. So you can imagine the amount of data points we had to go through to analyze this. And then all the devices, they were calibrated for the manufacturer specification. So the data that resulted from this is called bump data. It was removed from the overall analysis. So here's a picture of one of our area monitors in the field. This is on a resident's property. He was very eager to allow us access to collect data because of, these lived here for a long time, had to deal with the noxious smells. So yeah, this is a pretty portable device. As you can see, it's pretty easy to move around. Right on the other side of the wood line there is suspected point sources of the pollution from the mushroom farm. And then I want to point out that the other instrument on top here, that's our weather station. We collected weather data for a year. So unfortunately for this study, we didn't have time to analyze it, but a future study or a continuation of this project would be able to do that, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end. So here's the Google Maps images I was telling you about. So this whole thing right here is the mushroom farm. These dark brown earthy parts right here and right here, they are the spent mushroom compost. The last picture I showed you of the device is right here at location A. So you can see just how close this residence property is, as well as all these other homes are to the suspected point sources. I want to point out that these are not little ponds. They're not natural. They are retention ponds. They accumulated from runoff from this industry. So that's another suspected point source. And, just take into account how close our devices are to the mushroom industry. They're 100 to 600 feet away. Location C, that's on another residence property right across the road. The trucks are going in and out of there every day. And then if you'll notice over to the right, the PADEP has their own sampling location set up with their own area monitor. But this is, it's about half a mile away and it's about 100 feet in elevation. So it's not as close to the sources as our concentrations are, which has picked up some significant amounts of hydrogen sulfide.
All right, so just to add a few perspectives to everything so far. Contacted by New Garden Township, we were trying to figure out what was going on. What you might notice about location A and all surrounding these businesses, which Jess has pointed out, is there's a ton of residences that live here. So we're not talking about miles away, we're talking about right next door. So the residents through this whole industry who've lived near this industry through history have really tried to hone in on the fact that this was a concern, and just to catch us up a little bit in perspective too, that the Cobb et al. Study was promulgated by the issue of these odors. So there's really not a huge gap between the house and the farms, and you can see sort of the dynamic here, right? The substrate production is right next to the mushroom farms, even though we haven't really itemized on the list. Those piles get fed into the inoculation, which then are grown in the buildings, which are the grow houses. So with our sampling at those locations compared to the DEP sampling location, which is way off to the east, it's actually a half a mile away. So we kind of knew going into this from a historical perspective that that 0.2 parts per million that Victor was talking about really wasn't the best reading because it was a little bit too far away and it was at a much higher elevation. So one of the things that we looked at was how do we get closer and keep things at a similar elevation? That's what informed our locations here in cooperation with Chris Bryant from the township. So over the course of the year, our environmental sampling, we wound up with some interesting results. Just to talk about those, recall in our range of hydrogen sulfide exposure, low concentrations are enough to have a really bad, strong odor of sulfur. So what we found in our sampling, in summary, hydrogen sulfide, if the readings exceeded the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection regulation on ambient air quality, which is in contrast to what their own findings were. So this is a concern for the general public, especially sensitive populations, pregnant persons, children, people with asthma, especially elderly people who already struggle to breathe. Right, they're not healthy workers that are working in the farms. These are people with variable health statuses. The elevated levels did not exceed occupational regulations, as Victor pointed out. So we're somewhere above the DEP regulation, and we're somewhere under the occupational regulations. So we had to kind of carefully think about this. But what we were able to find is that these are elevated and irregular patterns. We were talking about ammonia and Methane as other gases of interest because those are produced in the composting process. So we were able to show that through our devices that they weren't actually detected during our 1 year sampling period. So more or less, we can say that they're not of concern, though we're not saying they're absent. So location A, just to recall the map up to the northeast of the compost piles. What we did, we started off by plotting from February 2023 to February 2024. So this was just almost a year ago, actually. Our readings are indicated on the title list. They're the maximum readings that occurred in the week over the course of a year at location A. So in any given week, when you look at this graph, these are the highest numbers that occurred during that week. And our very highest value occurred in December of 6.5 parts per million, which is well above the 0.2 that the DEP found. In addition to that, it still falls into the low concentration range, and it really talks about the potential that whoever's exposed to this range, again, this is on someone's property, this device, would be experiencing symptoms. So for the health perspective of this study, we are not suggesting that the exposure is the cause of symptoms, right? We're not able to do that. We have to kind of keep things in the boundaries of this was an ambient air quality study. So now we have a little bit of evidence to say that the air is stinky, even though we already knew it driving through there. So if we look at it through a seasonal perspective, this is just a shorter abbreviation. It's an abbreviation of the graph we just looked at. So we looked at spring, summer, fall, and winter. Concentrations up to 4 parts per million, most days of the week, not every day of the week. There's some zeros on this graph. Shows that there is a concentration. Most of them are actually above 0.1 parts per million, though we have to consider a little bit further details, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So spring up to 3.8 parts per million. Summer at location A, I'm still at location A, talking about the daily maximums now that occurred through the week. We're at 4.3 parts per million, which is still well above that 0.1. In fall, concentrations start to fall back a little bit. We're not seeing as many non-zero readings, but we do get a value over 2.5 parts per million. I think that's 2.7. And then in winter, we found our 6.5 somewhere around July 18th. And still a few values that are over 5 parts per million, which is quite high. Location B, we found similar patterns, but location B had a lot less a lot more zero readings through the weeks. Just to skip ahead, best case scenario, we're able to say that there were no concentrations for an entire month during the spring of 2023 at location B. Though something to consider, our devices, our limit of detection started at 0.5 parts per million, not 0.1. Our devices weren't that sensitive. So we're measuring things that occur over 0.5 parts per million. So anything between 0.5 and 0.1 could potentially exceed the Department of Environmental Protection regulations. So we more or less have a 5 times buffer here. So the best case scenario in this case shows that they're all 0, but it means that they're all below 0.5. So we really don't have as sensitive of a device that might be needed to really look at this. It's one of the limitations of our study. And still, location B in the summer, 1.2 parts per million is our highest, so a lot less compared to A, a lot of zeros. And then in fall, the same story, so a little bit more frequent zeros, so we may not have been as close to a point source as we thought. Up to 1.2 parts per million at location B in fall, and then in winter, we're still under 1 part per million, but a lot of zeros in there as well. Location C, this one's a little tricky, so we had to take our time to look at this and figure out what was going on. So in the beginning of the year, February 23, our device behaved pretty normally, and then we started getting a lot of information that talked about, that was reflective that there were really high concentrations going on, which was our upper limit of detection. So these were all readings up to 100 parts per million. So if anything was over that, it would be represented as 100 parts per million. So what we're showing here is that there were really high concentrations. So when we sat down and looked at our readings, these didn't typically follow a gas dispersion pattern that we would normally expect. So we had to discount this data actually, because some of these devices, they go wonky sometimes. The sensors get a little bit off. You know, there's limitations to the equipment, and we think this was one of those limitations. If this was really 100 parts per million, we would see people having severe health issues, and we weren't really hearing of that. So location C, during the spring, as I was just saying, it behaved pretty normally up to 1.2 parts per million, which is pretty on par with the rest of our readings. In the summer, still pretty consistent with what we were finding. A lot of zeros, but still low numbers in the low concentration range, not 100 parts per million. So anything after summer, we pretty much had to discount as, you know, dubious at best. So when we actually sat down and looked at what our maximums were, we had to compare that in comparison to the hourly average, which is what the DEP was saying. So if we plot our summer reading at July, at location A in July, we plotted our readings over the course of 1 hour. And then we put a red bar across the bottom, which talks about the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection hydrogen sulfide ambient air quality standard, which is 0.1 parts per million. So over the course of an hour, I think you can tell by the graph that they exceeded that ambient air quality standard. It reached as high as 1.6 parts per million. So we were able to infer from looking at this that the ambient air quality standard was exceeded. And so that's our first graph is already in contrast with what the DEP had found. When we go a little bit further, we look at December, which is where our 3.6 parts per million was. It's still above the DEP standard. Just to go a little bit faster here, because it's pretty much the consistent story. Location B in the summer, the devices were able to show exceedance of the regulation. In December, same story, exceedance of the regulation. Location C, which is the wonky device. When we look at an average in here, it's an exceedance of the regulation, and then we have to, again, cut out anything after the summer, because if I plotted it on here, it wouldn't make much sense. It'd just be a lot of ups and downs. So things that we looked at as far as temporal considerations, the question was, what day of the week are the highest peaks, the highest concentrations, or the highest spikes of hydrogen sulfide occurring? We found that Monday and Thursday is the most frequent days for this to happen. So something in the operating procedures, something about substrate disturbance. We don't quite know exactly what was going on, but we can say whatever the business operations were, regardless of whatever the business operations were, our devices were able to show Monday and Thursday were the most frequent high concentrations. Time of day was another thing that we wanted to look at. So at any given day during a high peak, if you were out in the environment, you would find the high peak occurring from midnight to 8 a.m. 42% of our findings showed that that's when those readings occurred. Second best was 4 p.m. to midnight. So it's really the evening hours that were correlated to or pairing with the peak readings. On the left here, just to talk about the metal corrosion, right? Just bringing it back, and we were talking about concerns about the durable equipment, including air conditioners at people's homes. The grounding rod on the left is actually our grounding rod for our weather station, which is copper. And if you know anything about copper, when it oxidizes, it turns green. And we've got some green in there, but not predominantly all green. Actually, there's a little bit of a black powder that's accumulated on this. And what we've suspected, this is a little bit more qualitative, not quantitative, is that this is a conjugate of a form of hydrogen or sulfuric acid, which is formed through the interaction of hydrogen sulfide and oxygen. And on the right is our bolts from the weather station. These were some sort of iron or steel that corroded pretty heavily. And again, these were only out here for a year, but when you look at the grounding rod, which is at Dr. Cena's house, it's been out there for a decade. It's not accumulating all this black powder. This is pretty typical of a iron oxidation or copper oxidation, excuse me. So in summary, our data shows that the DEP regulations have been exceeded. It's in contrast with their findings, which occurred the year prior to our sampling. What we found is our highest rating was 6.5, which is 33 times higher than what they found. And that statement is true while we discarded all of that data at location C that was really high. So to go forward, we're really gonna have to rely on some help from the industries, because what we would like to do is associate worker tasks and point sources with what's going on in the business. What are the employees doing? What job tasks cause a release of hydrogen sulfide, and in what amount or concentration? So we're really gonna have to leverage our interactions and support from the American Mushroom Institute, farm operators, senators and representatives, local government, which we're already working with, and federal regulatory agencies. Essentially, we already know there's an issue here based on our data. We know people are affected by this. We know it can cause symptoms. So how do we manage this issue? Because it's not enough to say that the businesses have more or less unfettered ability to release these gases into the environment. So how do we approach this in a more sustainable manner? Just a little bit about what's going on with this project as far as dissemination goes. All three of us have presented at ARCAD last year. We took second place. In September of 24, Dr. Cena presented his presentation at the New Garden Township in Chester County. We released and completed and submitted the technical report, which is something like 83 pages in January 25. And on the right here is Dr. Cena being credited with the delivery of the study report. Today, February 25, we're here with you. Thanks for having us. In March, I'll be sharing a poster at President Bernofsky's inauguration. April, we've submitted our completed research application for Student Research Creative Activity Day, SRCA. We're hoping to build up and get one of our undergrads prepared for July. Hopefully he's gonna go to the National Environmental Health Association conference that's going on in Arizona. He's gonna present a poster there on the same topic. In May, Jess and I have submitted for sponsorship to attend the American Industrial Hygiene Association and again present a poster. And our future prospect in November is to potentially present these findings at the American Public Health Association in Washington, D.C. So just to pause for a moment here, we've actually already received funding from, well, we haven't received, we're still working out some of the contract details. It's a little tricky, apparently. We were awarded a grant of $157,000, which will allow us to install additional devices, up to 10. We're gonna have a little bit more sensitivity with our devices, though we were not able to get something down to the 0.1 parts per million, which is where the regulatory standard is. We can read a little bit higher than 100 parts per million, up to 500 parts per million. So what data we've discounted, we're not expecting to find something up to 500 parts per million, but if it does occur, we'll have the ability to capture it in a more accurate manner. It's going to focus exclusively on hydrogen sulfide and span 2 years. So a year of sampling and a year of analysis. The hope with that, again, is to associate worker tasks with the release of hydrogen sulfide into the environment. And then one of the other things that we're going to do with our existing data is hopefully publish this into the Journal of Environmental Health. So we're working on the manuscript for that. Last but not least, the revisions. We're hoping to work with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to offer revisions and insights to the best practices for environmental protection in the mushroom farm community. We know there's an issue with sustainability. We have some ideas on how to address that. In fact, we made recommendations in the technical report that would help with this. So we would really like to offer, again, in the scope of what West Chester University is about, community services, the insights that we've learned through our Masters of Public Health to help the industry grow and continue to protect people's health, which is NPH all the way. Last but not least, we owe some acknowledgements to the Office of Sustainability and the Sustainability Council. Thanks for having us. Thanks for inviting us. Kelly, thank you for your invitation. Dr. Flam, Dr. Bradley Flan, thank you. Dr. Cena, thank you for mentoring us and getting us this far. With that, we have a reference slide, but if anybody has any questions, we're here. We'll be happy to answer them.
Make the Zoom bigger, so Zoom folks, feel free to ask questions, and it looks like Cheryl already has a question. Why don't you kick it off?
Hi, and this might take it your research, which is great. This is so impressive, and especially like your future plans, so impressive. And the local community, I'm sure, really appreciates this. But my question might take you outside of that expertise a little bit. I recognize that no one should have to live in, situations where where the release of harmful gases is causing health problems. But I also have friends who are farmers who are concerned about land planning. So I'm wondering if in your like work and discussions with New Garden, there was a discussion of like plopping down developments right next to mushroom farms, and maybe this has to do maybe with the locations of your detection sites too. Like, were they in new developments? Were they in old established developments? Because there's a lot of times when land planning is not done smartly and in coordination with the farms and facilities that are already in the area.
That I think you make an excellent point. It's not something that I've immediately given a lot of thought to, though it's very valid to consider, who came first, the mushroom farms or the houses? And I would probably make a little bit of an assumption that it's both. Some houses were there and then developments went in, but it really speaks to the fact that there isn't much of a regulation about what type of boundary should exist. So it begs the question, what's a safe buffer zone to address this issue as far as residents and proximity to the business? Though keeping in mind too that we also have to consider the perspective of the workers, right? We've got the residential concerns. We can push them away in theory, but really we really do want to understand what's worst case scenario and what's going on sort of at the source. But I think you've really given an incredible perspective to this, that did the residents build around the farms, or did they actually kind of explode together? And knowing what I know about the history of the mushroom farming industry is that they grew together, both the substrate production and the mushroom farms, but probably the residents as well. That provided job opportunities for local residents and invited expansion in the area.
I can add to that. I know people that have lived there for a couple of decades, and they would tell you 10 years ago, it was tolerable. I bought my house 10 years ago, and yeah, maybe there was some smell, but it was tolerable. But now it's really getting to the point where it's every day, all time of the day, and it gets worse at certain times of the year. So as the mushroom industry has grown, I think the problem is the fact that nobody has really looked into, our literature review shows that there's hardly anything done and looking at the air quality with this smell. So if somebody had done maybe the studies before and realized there's some dangerous emissions here, maybe we shouldn't plan residential neighborhoods near this with the potential of this industry growing, that could have helped the planning. But not knowing anything and just, growing together, the residents and the industry, and now we're at the point where it's exploded. And now the residents are really fed up and they say something needs to be done because our properties are losing value. We cannot, it's embarrassing to have family and friend coming to visit us because it just smells so bad. And like, where do you guys live? I mean, if you go in the area, I would rather live on a dairy farm and smell cow manure all day than the mushroom compost smell, because that's like a much more pungent and very noxious odor that makes you wish that you were smelling cow manure instead, right? It's hard to describe unless you've actually been there. So, they worry about that. I have friends that bought a house. They say we had to sell it and move away. They lived in the house for about, I think for 2 years. I say, we don't even know why we stayed there for 2 years. We were wake up in the middle of the night by the odor. The smell would wake us up at night because it was coming and permeating inside the house. And so to Daniel's point is also, if we're picking up these measurements in the neighborhoods, after the wind is dispersed and diluted the concentration, what are the workers smelling and being exposed to? It must be hundreds of times higher inside the enclosed facility of the farm where you have the compost right there. So if we're picking it up at 6 parts per million, it must be hundreds of parts per million inside the facility. But unfortunately, we cannot get inside the farms because the farmers do not want us to go in. I've met with the farmers and with the American Mushroom Institute, and I presented this data to them before giving it to the township. I said, I want you to know what we're studying, what we've done, and what the measurements are to make you aware that you have a problem. And I'd like to collaborate with you and help you solve this problem. And we'd like to come in and just help you for free, put these instruments on your property, put them next to the lagoon, inside, and see where the sources are. And the response was, it is not in our best interest for the public to find out the readings of the air quality. And so here we are, all we can do is just go as close as we can to the fence and see what the public is getting.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Based on what you shared, do you think in the future, I know that at DEP that's public, there could possibly be state or county level intervention for workers' rights? Because I feel like that's a massive infringement because their health is being endangered and more so than what was being presented. Because the readings were wrong in the air in public, that means, of course, the workers are even more endangered. So I was just wondering, do you think that's going to affect any future work laws, mandates, or anything?
oh, that's a fantastic question. Just to elaborate a little bit further backwards, Sexsmith et al., she's a researcher, Kathleen from Penn State. She looked at she did a qualitative study amongst the employees that worked in the area. And what was really interesting, I think it was 3 of 44 people who worked there, which were immigrants. This was done in Spanish. And there's a few assumptions that you could make with that is that they may not be aware of their rights. That 3 of 44 people actually expressed the concern that they had difficulty breathing. And one of the things that really was interesting about this research topic was, well, we know things can get bad, we know it can affect respiratory issues, and we're measuring so far away versus inside. Is how come there was so little concern about the difficulty of breathing, right? So it's less than, I don't know, it's approximated, it's less than 10% of people who had that concern. So if the residents are so concerned, how come the workers also aren't concerned? And there's a little bit of a fine line there that we don't have a perfect answer to. We know as far as the regulatory agencies go, NIOSH and OSHA, that if they were to look at this issue inside the facilities and find exceedance of that regulation, the business would be required to take action by law, not just by suggestion. I mean, that's their maximum limits. You can't exceed those. So it's a little bit of a nuanced area because the workers who their primary language is not English, there may be some difficulties trying to glean what awareness of rights they may have, versus, because there's a number of visa immigrants or other employees that work there. So that's something we would like to understand. And to Dr. Chain's point about how, they're not letting us in there, our suspicion is that the ratings could exceed those regulations and, we're not allowed in there. So we're doing, from our perspective, from the third party perspective, working with the public, we're kind of giving it our best to really capture what's the worst case scenario. And regretfully, I mean, as time goes forward, I'd like to think this would be an unavoidable question, but right now we're not able to really explore that question directly.
Well, thank you.
Well,
To add to that, so, agriculture is its own beast, and they're allowed to get away with so much more than any other industry. Probably OSHA, would not go in and take measurements unless a fatality or something really bad occurs. So we kind of question like, first of all, would we even know if there was a fatality or something bad, or would it be a person that maybe was an immigrant that didn't even know how to report, maybe it was underreported, like somebody else concerned. They don't know that they're protected under OSHA laws, whether they are immigrants on a visa, or, it doesn't matter. OSHA protects workers, period, not workers with a work permit. So if 3 or more workers were to go to the CDC and say, we are concerned about our health, we're getting these symptoms, we'd like for you to come in, they would have the right to go in and take measurements. But again, you have to let enough people know that they can do that, and they should do that. They are not worried about what happens if they find out that I was the one. So there's no problem with that.
One other thing I'd like to add, because Dr. Chen reminded me of this, when you look at the battle between the township and the industry, what really gets captured in that, there's something called the acre law, ACRE. I believe it's an abbreviation for something, and it really talks about agricultural regulation where townships don't have the authority or ability to regulate the sort of emissions and behaviors of agriculture. It's left to the state. And so if a township were to try and regulate this, the business could say, hey, the powers that be through the acre law, they're trying to regulate our behavior, which is illegal. So they're trying to regulate this issue on a local level really is impossible because of that. I mean, that's the context of Pennsylvania.
I think we're gonna pause here because it's after 12:15. Want to give everybody a chance to get to class if they need to, or anywhere else they might start at 1. But let's do another round of applause and thank you. And you can always ask them questions on your way out, and please also take these. There's like 5 left. We don't want them to go to waste. So thank you, everybody. I'm gonna stop the recording, and I think I'll stop the Zoom. I think a lot of our audience is getting ready to leave, but thank